We are Paco and Lucia, the AI moderator bots, narrating this podcast created by German Echavarria, where German attached more than 47 sources on the subject, and under his script and direction, we, Paco and Lucia, helped him structure and narrate it. We hope you enjoy it.
All right, so...
Well, actually, imagine this for a second.
Yeah.
You win a national presidential election, right? You move into the presidential palace.
Okay, yeah.
And then you wake up and realize your defeated opponents have already, legally changed the locks on every single door inside the building.
That is, well, it's a pretty wild image, but honestly, it perfectly captures the exact mechanical reality of the Colombian state right now in July 2026.
Yeah, today we're diving into this massive paradox, how a political coalition lost the presidency but somehow kept the keys to the entire country.
It really is a masterclass in institutional design. We're looking at how the left-wing coalition, the Historic Pact, managed to build the strategy where they actually wield vastly more practical day-to-day power right now as the opposition than they did when they were running the executive branch for the last 4 years.
Which is just crazy to think about. But before we really start mapping out all the gears of this paradox, we have to lay down some ground rules for you, the listener.
Definitely. The stack of documentation we're working with from German is just monumental.
Yeah, it's over 47 distinct sources. And I spent hours going through these. The variety is honestly staggering.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you've got dense, highly technical legal concepts from the Council of Bogota.
Right.
And then rigorous academic risk analysis reports from places like the Political Observatory of the Americas or Colombia Risk Analysis.
And that's all blended with, street-level chronicles, you know. YouTube dispatches from outlets like La Silvacia, plus the official party manifestos.
Exactly. But the defining characteristic of all these 47 sources is just how heavily saturated they are with polarized political emotion.
Oh, yeah. They clash violently.
They really do. I mean, we are dealing with deeply entrenched left-wing perspectives, staunchly defended right-wing positions, and some very, very anxious centrist analyses.
So, because of that, it is absolutely imperative that we establish a pact of complete neutrality for this deep dive.
Right. We are here strictly to look at the mechanics of power, the institutional engines, the constitutional architecture.
Exactly. We're not here to judge the moral or ideological rightness of the left or the right. That's not our job today.
No, not at all. We're just impartially reporting on the content provided to convey the ideas that are actually in the original source material.
And that neutrality is crucial, because the mechanics we're about to discuss, they apply to literally any boardroom, any corporate risk meeting, or just any structural analysis of a modern democracy trying to survive extreme stress.
Right. We are analyzing the engine here, not the color of the paint.
Love that. Okay, so let's set the scene in the present day, July 2026.
Okay.
The dust is just settling on what is arguably one of the most fraught, razor-close presidential elections in Colombian history.
Yeah, the winner of the executive branch is this right-wing outsider, Abelardo de la Espriella.
Right, universally known in the press as the Tiger.
The Tiger, exactly. And the electoral margins here are highly indicative of just how polarized the landscape is right now.
It's so close.
Incredibly close. De la Espriella secured the presidency in the second round with 49.6% of the vote.
Barely edging out the Historic Pact's candidate, Ivan Cepeda, who got 48.7%.
Right. And the sources really emphasize that De la Espriella campaigned on this hardline, anti-establishment, aggressively pro-business platform.
Yeah, the political science analyses in our stack explicitly compare his rhetoric and his punitive security policies to figures like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador.
Or Javier Milei in Argentina, right. He's projecting this image of iron-fisted executive authority.
And this is where it gets fascinating. I was looking at the congressional data for his new political movement, Defenders of the Homeland. And this is where that projected image of absolute authority violently collides with mathematical reality.
It really does.
Because despite winning the national executive mandate, De la Espriella's party managed to secure a grand total of 4 seats in the Senate, 4 senators out of 108.
That is just an astonishing statistical anomaly. You've got this president acting like an unstoppable force, but he has an almost microscopic legislative footprint.
Right. So operating a hyper-presidential system with a legislative base of 4 senators, that creates a power vacuum of epic proportions.
And to understand the gravity of that vacuum, we have to look at the posture of the defeated coalition.
The Historic Pact.
Right. Because they did not fracture. They didn't collapse into all these internal recriminations after losing the presidency.
No, they didn't. The sources document this immediate, highly unified strategic pivot.
They instantly declared themselves the official opposition, and they brought with them this incredibly cohesive bloc of 67 congressmen.
Yeah, 25 in the Senate and 42 in the House of Representatives.
It's massive.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, the military analysts who contributed to the source material, they kept using this analogy that I found brilliant.
The Roman phalanx.
Yes, the Roman phalanx. They used it to describe the Historic Pact's current legislative formation. And structurally, it's perfect.
It really is, because the phalanx is entirely based on the concept of interlocking shields, right?
Exactly. The unit moves as this single, impenetrable wall of bronze. The moment one soldier breaks rank, to pursue personal glory or fight a little individual skirmish,
The shield wall opens,
right, the enemy breaches the line, and the entire unit is slaughtered.
and the sources show the Historic Pact is operating with that exact life-or-death discipline right now. They're maintaining a 67-member shield wall.
But wait, let me push back on this a bit, because I think a lot of people listening might be wondering the same thing.
Sure.
If Espriella has the mandate of the voters, how can a minority block? 67 votes isn't a 51% majority on the plenary floor. How can they effectively paralyze him?
That's the key right there. The general public assumes those 67 votes aren't enough because of the grand plenary floor.
Right.
But power in the Colombian Congress does not reside on the plenary floor. The true architectural leverage is inside the Constitutional Commission.
Okay, the sources refer to those as the funnels of power.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Let's break down the mechanics of those commissions. A presidential reform cannot just be introduced to the entire Senate for a grand vote.
It has to go through a funnel first.
Right. It must first be assigned to one of the 7 specialized constitutional commissions.
So, the first commission handles constitutional amendments?
Yep. The 3rd handles taxes, the 7th handles health and labor, and so on.
And these are what, small windowless rooms?
Basically, yeah. They only have maybe 14 or 20 members.
Huh.
And if a bill does not survive the initial debates and voting within that specific commission,
It legally dies.
exactly, it never reaches the plenary floor.
Yeah.
The public never even sees the final vote.
Wow. So by identifying those commissions as the critical choke points, the left realized their minority bloc of 67 congressmen was actually a lethal weapon.
As long as they could strategically capture the presidencies of those specific committee rooms.
But the math within those microenvironments, they still needed a few extra votes to get absolute control.
Right. They did. And that structural necessity birthed what is arguably the most tactically astonishing move documented in the entire stack of our 47 sources.
Okay, I was absolutely floored when I read the documentation on this.
It's wild.
To capture the presidencies of these crucial commissions, the left-wing Historic Pact literally walked across the aisle and forged a purely bureaucratic, transactional alliance with their most bitter existential rivals.
Álvaro Uribe's extreme right Democratic Center Party.
That is insane. It's a hostile corporate merger between 2 failing competitors who absolutely despise each other.
But they're combining their voting shares strictly to prevent a hostile takeover from a third party.
In this case, President de la Espriella. It's like 2 sworn enemies tying themselves together inside a shelter just to survive a massive hurricane.
Yeah, knowing full well they'll betray each other the second the storm passes.
Exactly.
But the underlying logic of that bureaucratic alliance actually strips away decades of ideological warfare.
How so?
Because both the Historic Pact and the Democratic Center recognize that a populist outsider president with massive executive ambition but zero congressional grounding is an existential threat.
A threat to the traditional institutional power structures they both rely on.
Right. So by temporarily sharing the seats and votes required to dominate those commission directorates, they built an impenetrable wall against the executive.
And the crown jewel of this hostile merger, the thing they really wanted, was the capture of the presidency of the Accusations Commission.
Yes, the sources highlight this specific committee room for a very, very critical reason.
Under the Colombian Constitution, the Accusations Commission of the House of Representatives is the sole legislative body legally authorized to initiate formal investigations against a sitting president.
The only one that can open a trial against the President of the Republic.
So by taking control of that specific commission, the Historic Pact and their temporary allies have basically positioned this institutional sword of Damocles directly over de la Espriella's head.
And they did it before he even assumed office.
Which is just a brilliant, ruthless chokehold. If he attempts to overstep his executive boundaries,
Say, by issuing unilateral decrees to bypass their congressional blockade.
The opposition controls the exact, exclusive legal mechanism required to remove him from power.
Right. It transforms political opposition into a hard constitutional checkmate. It's the ultimate insurance policy.
But, having the threat of impeachment in your back pocket is the nuclear option.
Sure.
You don't detonate a nuclear weapon to stop, like, a daily legislative agenda.
No, you need everyday tools for that.
Right. So to understand how they plan to execute the day-to-day blockade, I dug into the architectural blueprint detailed in the sources.
The opposition statute.
Yes, legally classified as Statutory Law 1909 of 2018. This is the rule book.
And it's the exact same legal framework that tormented the left for the last 4 years, but now they are using it with absolute precision.
Okay, unpack the legal teeth of this statute for us, because it's more than just a diploma on the wall.
Oh, absolutely. Law 1909 fundamentally altered the balance of power in Colombia. Before it passed, being the opposition was mostly just a rhetorical posture.
Like, you could complain, but you couldn't do much.
Right. It carried moral weight, but very little institutional leverage. The statute was actually designed in the wake of the peace process to guarantee tangible material rights to political minorities.
To make sure the state apparatus couldn't be weaponized to crush dissent.
Exactly. For example, it mandates direct state funding for officially declared opposition parties, so the executive branch can't just financially starve them out.
Okay, so the financial guarantees keep the engine running, but the statute also heavily regulates the media landscape, right?
Oh, big time. Say President de la Espriella utilizes a primetime national broadcast to unveil a new security policy.
Right.
The opposition statute grants the Historic Pact the legally enforceable right to demand equal time on those exact same national networks.
Just to broadcast an immediate rebuttal.
Yes. The executive branch is legally prohibited from monopolizing the national narrative.
That is powerful. But honestly, looking at the sources, the most structurally devastating mechanism embedded in Law 1909 is the power to dictate the congressional agenda.
The order of the day.
Yes. The statute dictates that several times a year, the opposition has the legal authority to completely take over the scheduling of debates.
In both the commissions and the plenary floor.
They get to dictate what legislation is discussed, what bills are prioritized.
And crucially, what executive reforms are indefinitely tabled.
When I was reading this, I thought of a boxing match analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Standard politics is a lot like boxing. Right. Weaving, blocking, throwing punches.
Sure.
But the opposition statute introduces this binding rule where 3 times around, the referee blows a whistle, and the president is legally forced to drop his guard, stand completely still in the center of the ring, and just absorb unanswered punches for 2 solid minutes.
That's a great way to visualize it. He cannot dodge. He cannot counterattack.
Right. The opposition uses this agenda-setting power to summon the president's cabinet ministers for political control hearings.
Which means forcing the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Defense to endure hours of hostile, detailed interrogation.
All while the government's actual legislative priorities just sit frozen in traffic. And it makes you wonder, does this tool truly promote democratic transparency? Or does it just create chronic, inescapable legislative traffic jams?
Well, the effectiveness of those political control hearings relies entirely on their punitive enforcement.
Explain that. What happens if a minister just says no?
If a summoned minister decides that managing the country takes precedence over attending a hostile congressional interrogation, they can't simply decline the invitation.
They had to show up.
Yes. Under the disciplinary mechanisms attached to the statute, refusing to attend a legally mandated political control session without a profoundly justified, legally sanctioned excuse is classified as a grave disciplinary fault.
Yeah. Reading the legal analyses in the sources, the threat of prevaricato, a public official knowingly acting contrary to the law, is constant.
It hangs over everything. The Procuraduría, which acts as the supreme disciplinary watchdog for public officials in Colombia, can immediately open an investigation.
So the minister isn't just risking bad PR. They are risking their entire career.
Facing the prospect of being stripped of their office and permanently barred from holding public service.
Wow. So the statute operates as an institutional straitjacket.
It does. And the academic sources heavily underscore the profound irony here.
Right, because the architects of this labyrinthine institutional fortress,
the left-wing politicians who champion these exact guarantees of the opposition statute,
are now standing on the outside, using every lock, chain, and mandated delay mechanism to lay siege to the government.
Meanwhile, The new right-wing president and his cabinet are trapped inside, getting bludgeoned by the very legal tools the left previously used to survive.
It's incredible. But the efficiency and ruthlessness with which the Historic Pact is wielding this statute in 2026, it's not an accident.
No, not at all.
They learned exactly how to weaponize these tools by watching the previous opposition spectacularly fail to use them.
And to truly grasp the mechanics of the current blockade, we really have to transition back to the period between 2022 and 2026.
When Gustavo Petro held executive power, and the traditional right-wing establishment was the one tasked with playing defense.
Right. Analyzing the onset of the Petro administration in August 2022 provides a really striking contrast.
Yeah, because when the left assumed executive power, they did not face an impenetrable wall of opposition in the legislature.
Not at all. The data from the first year of the Petro government reveals the construction of a legislative steamroller.
The numbers are insane. The administration managed to secure a coalition that controls 79 out of 108 senators and 140 out of 184 representatives in the lower house.
Which represents an absolute supermajority.
Yeah, that is the mathematical threshold you need to actually rewrite the Constitution and fundamentally alter the economic model of the state.
But, and this is a huge but, the political science analyses in the stack emphasize that this supermajority was not built on a foundation of ideological awakening.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
The traditional center-right parties didn't suddenly adopt left-wing doctrine.
No, the coalition was an exercise in pure transactional politics.
Let's talk about the Jenga tower analogy here, because I think it fits perfectly.
Let's do it.
Petro's administration recognized that passing their ambitious structural reforms required the votes controlled by the traditional machinery, right?
Yep. And to acquire those votes, the executive branch heavily distributed bureaucratic influence.
They were handing out powerful ministries, directorships of key state agencies, regional budgets.
Mostly to the traditional Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and the U Party.
So the government essentially purchased legislative compliance through patronage.
Sure.
And the architecture of that coalition is exactly like a massive Jenga tower. It looks incredibly intimidating and solid from a distance, towering over the political landscape.
But the blocks aren't glued together by shared values or long-term vision.
Right, they're just balanced on top of each other through delicate transactional deals.
The foundational blocks consist of the ideological left,
While the entire upper structure is composed of traditional center-right politicians who are only sitting there because they were handed a ministry.
which makes it incredibly unstable. The structural vulnerability of a transactional coalition becomes instantly apparent the moment the executive demands the passage of legislation that threatens the core interests of those traditional blocs.
And for the Petro administration, the catalyst for the collapse was the introduction of the flagship health and labor reforms.
Because these were not minor administrative adjustments, they proposed a systemic dismantling of the existing economic models.
Right. Digging into the mechanics of those reforms really explains the panic they induced. The health reform aimed to effectively eliminate the EPS, right?
Yes, the private insurance entities that manage healthcare funds. They wanted to transition a mixed private-public system into a heavily centralized state-payer model.
And for the traditional center-right parties, this was an existential threat.
Because they rely heavily on the localized regional administration of those mixed healthcare funds for political patronage and constituent support.
Ah, I see. And the labor reform similarly threatened to dramatically increase operational costs for the private businesses that fund those center-right campaigns.
Exactly. So, faced with the reality that holding a cabinet ministry was simply not worth the political cost of destroying the private healthcare system their constituents and donors relied on,
The traditional parties calculated their defection.
they began pulling their support from the key commissions.
The transactional blocks were removed from the Jenga tower, and the entire supermajority coalition wobbled and crashed to the floor.
The president was suddenly isolated and highly vulnerable.
Okay, so according to standard political logic, the collapse of the government's supermajority should have been the exact moment the right-wing opposition swooped in, united their factions, locked their shields, and seized control of the legislative agenda.
Right, that's what should have happened. But the source documents reveal a profound failure of leadership instead.
Yeah, rather than uniting, the right-wing establishment splintered into a dozen competing factions.
Driven primarily by the massive egos of historic leaders, you had Alvaro Uribe of the Democratic Center and German Vargas Lleras of Radical Change.
And they just refused to coordinate a unified defensive strategy.
They did. And this fragmentation of the opposition gave rise to a strategic failure that the academic sources critique with absolute devastation.
They call it conceptual frivolity.
Conceptual frivolity. Instead of utilizing the mechanisms of the opposition statute to mandate deep technical debates on the actuarial deficits of the reforms within those constitutional commissions,
Right.
a highly vocal faction of the extra-institutional right chose to operate almost entirely within the attention economy of social media.
The sources specifically name figures like Senator Maria Fernanda Cabal and Representative Miguel Polo Polo as the primary architects of this conceptual frivolity.
And when you look at the examples provided in the reporting, the contrast between the stakes of the legislation and the focus of the opposition is just jarring.
It really is. I mean, while the government was attempting to overhaul the National Labor Code,
These legislators spent weeks waging ferocious, highly produced public campaigns expressing outrage over the fact that Vice President Francia Marquez utilized a state helicopter to travel to her residence.
or focusing intense media scrutiny on the designer brand and price tag of the shoes worn by the Minister of Mines.
Exactly. Now, analyzing the mechanics of the modern attention economy explains why this approach is tempting.
Sure, generating a viral video about a politician's expensive shoes or a helicopter ride yields millions of views.
It drives algorithm engagement, and it reliably triggers emotional outrage among the voting base.
It's a highly efficient method for building personal brand awareness.
But the political science papers in our stack demonstrate how this strategy fundamentally abdicates the responsibility of institutional power.
Why? Because while it generated all those emotional clicks and likes, it basically gave the government a massive smokescreen.
Exactly. If the entire national media apparatus and the political discourse of the week are totally consumed by a fiery debate over the price of a minister's sneakers,
They are completely ignoring the 150-page technical annex of a pension reform that's quietly being fast-tracked through a secondary commission.
the administration was more than happy to endure the superficial outrage regarding helicopters because it shielded the actual structural dismantling of the macroeconomy from rigorous public scrutiny.
To contextualize just how severe this strategic error was, the sources draw a sharp, sobering contrast with the opposition tactics utilized in neighboring Venezuela.
Yes, figures like Maria Corina Machado and Leopoldo Lopez.
They have faced a state apparatus that operates entirely outside democratic norms, wielding the judicial and military branches as direct weapons of repression.
Yet the Venezuelan opposition leadership deliberately avoided squandering their limited political capital on the aesthetic choices or personal hypocrisies of regime officials.
Right. They ignored the frivolities. They maintained a laser focus on the structural constitutional breaches.
They utilized their energy to document electoral fraud, expose the unconstitutional packing of the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, and meticulously record systemic human rights violations.
They focused relentlessly on the architecture of the state. And when compared to that level of rigor, the Colombian right's obsession with viral social media outrage appeared deeply unserious to the business sector and centrist voters.
Voters who were desperately looking for real institutional defense.
Exactly. Now, to ensure balanced reporting, we have to highlight the exceptions within the right-wing bloc.
Yes, the institutional right.
Because while the extra-institutional figures chased dopamine on social media, there was a faction that engaged in cold, hard, data-driven legislative warfare.
The documentation specifically elevates the work of Representative Andres Ferrero of the Democratic Center. They present his methodology as the literal blueprint for effective opposition.
Let's analyze Ferrero's strategy because it reveals a heavy reliance on a fundamental constitutional mechanism known as the derecho de petición.
The legal right of petition, enshrined in Article 23 of the Colombian Constitution.
And this isn't just a polite request for information, right?
No, it is a binding legal mechanism that forces government entities, ministries, and public officials to surrender internal documents, financial projections, and communications within strict, legally mandated deadlines.
Under penalty of disciplinary action.
Exactly. So Ferrero and his team weaponized the derecho de petición. They filed thousands of these legal requests to systematically carpet bomb the ministries with paperwork.
just legally forcing the government to release their own internal actuarial studies and fiscal projections regarding the health and pension reforms.
And by analyzing the administration's own hidden data, Forero uncovered massive fiscal black holes and contradictory math regarding the long-term sustainability of the proposed state payer models.
And that data warfare translated directly into legislative power.
It did. He didn't need to generate outrage on Twitter.
He simply walked into the 7th Commission, held up the Ministry of Finance's own internal contradictory spreadsheets, and mathematically proved the reforms were fiscally impossible.
He utilized the government's own bureaucracy as a weapon to dismantle their arguments.
But, despite those isolated examples of rigorous opposition, the broader fragmentation of the center-right created an escalating tension that inevitably pushed the Colombian democratic system toward an ultimate stress test.
Right. And the transition into the year 2025 marks the climax of this institutional pressure cooker.
Okay, so let's break down this 2025 crisis. Because to understand the explosion that occurred in June of that year, we first have to examine the massive shift in lobbying power that preceded it.
Historically, for decades, the major corporate associations, organizations like ANDI, representing the national entrepreneurs, and FINALCO, representing the merchants, they enjoyed privileged, direct access to the executive branch.
What analysts often refer to as the red carpet to the presidency.
Yes. The mechanics of that red carpet were very straightforward. If the business elite had a critical concern regarding, say, a new export tariff or a corporate tax hike,
the president of ANDI could simply initiate a phone call, secure a private meeting at the Casa de Nariño, the presidential palace, and negotiate a quiet consensus directly with the president or the minister of finance.
It was a localized, highly efficient system of elite conflict resolution.
But the Petro administration, operating on a mandate of systemic change and anti-establishment rhetoric, deliberately severed that red carpet.
They completely cut it off. The executive branch refused to attend major corporate summits. They marginalized the input of business leaders on the drafting of the social reforms and fundamentally locked the economic elite out of the Casa de Nariño.
And the structural consequence of that decision was profound. I mean, when the most powerful, well-funded economic sectors in the country lose access to the executive,
they immediately redirect all their immense lobbying pressure, their legal teams, their financial weight, toward the only institution capable of halting the president.
the Congress.
Exactly. All of that centralized corporate pressure, which used to be quietly absorbed and mitigated within the walls of the presidential palace,
Was suddenly dumped directly into the narrow, fragile funnels of the constitutional commissions.
and the result was a catastrophic legislative bottleneck.
The Congress was just caught between a radicalized executive demanding sweeping reforms and a terrified, hyper-mobilized business sector demanding total obstruction.
It simply ceased to function.
To illustrate this bottleneck, there's a specific data point from the sources regarding the 7th Commission of the Senate that is just wild.
Yeah, the flagship labor reform.
Right. The government had staked massive political capital on pushing through this comprehensive overhaul designed to increase worker protections, expand union powers, mandate higher overtime pay.
And it reached the 7th Commission, which possesses jurisdiction over labor and health issues, and it just hit an impenetrable wall.
And the numbers here are staggering when you consider the scale of national politics.
Because Gustavo Petro won the presidency with millions of votes across the country.
Yet his signature labor reform, the absolute cornerstone of his economic agenda, was completely sunk by exactly 8 people.
8 senators out of the 14 who sit on the 7th Commission voted to archive the bill.
8 people. And under the procedural calendar, archiving a bill means it legally dies for that legislative period, right?
Right. It must be entirely resubmitted from scratch the following year. Those 8 votes essentially erased a year of the executive's mandate.
Wow. So the realization that his entire national agenda was being strangled inside these tiny committee rooms by traditional politicians and corporate pressure, that drove the executive to a breaking point.
It did. Frustrated by the institutional blockade, President Petro chose to escalate the conflict to the absolute limit.
On June 3, 2025.
Yes, the administration deployed what every single analyst in our stack of sources universally describes as the nuclear option.
Let's detail the mechanics of this June 3rd decree, because it represents a direct assault on the separation of powers.
President Petro issued an emergency executive decree attempting to completely bypass the paralyzed Congress and mandate a direct popular consultation.
He sought to place his health, labor, and pension reforms directly on a national ballot, asking the citizens to vote them into law, entirely circumventing the legislative branch.
But the most fascinating mechanical detail within the sources regarding this decree is the requirement of signatures.
Oh, this is fascinating. President Petro did not sign the June 3rd decree in isolation?
No, he legally mandated all 18 of his cabinet ministers, from the Minister of the Interior down to the Minister of Culture and the Minister of Sports, to sign the document alongside him.
And under the specific frameworks of the Colombian Constitution, regulating extraordinary decrees that assume legislative-like powers.
The signature of the entire cabinet establishes solidary legal responsibility.
By forcing their signatures, Petro bound his entire executive team to the legal consequences of the decree.
It was a loyalty test functioning as a legal shield.
But the shield instantly shattered because the decree crossed a blazing, undeniable constitutional red line.
The mechanisms for initiating a popular consultation of that magnitude are strictly governed by Article 104 of the Constitution.
And Article 104 explicitly dictates that a president cannot unilaterally summon the population for a vote.
The consultation requires the prior, formal, written approval of the Senate.
And the chronology provided in the sources highlights just how blatant the illegality of the move was, because the Senate had already formally debated the president's request for a popular consultation.
And explicitly voted to deny it just 2 weeks prior on May 14th.
So the June 3rd emergency decree was not merely a creative bypass of legislative procedure. It was a direct, legally documented defiance of a constitutional prerequisite.
And the institutional pushback was instantaneous and massive. The system fired back with every weapon available.
8 different political parties, spanning from the staunch right-wing opposition to centrist independent blocs, immediately joined forces and filed lawsuits against the administration in the Council of State.
Now, for context for you listening, the Council of State in Colombia is the supreme administrative court.
Right.
It possesses the specific constitutional mandate to review, suspend, and annul decrees issued by the executive branch if they violate administrative law or constitutional procedure.
And simultaneously, the disciplinary watchdogs engage their own mechanisms.
The Procurator General, Gregorio Eljak, acting as the supreme disciplinary authority, immediately opened formal investigations against all 18 cabinet ministers who affixed their signatures to the decree.
Because they signed a document that explicitly bypassed the Senate's prior denial, they were investigated for the charge of prevaricado.
Right, the grave offense of a public official knowingly issuing an illegal resolution.
So the entire executive cabinet was suddenly facing the imminent prospect of being stripped of their offices, heavily fined, and permanently banned from public service.
The Congress was a brick wall. The Supreme Administrative Court was preparing to annul the decree, and the Procuraduría had a disciplinary guillotine poised over the cabinet.
But this crisis did not remain confined to air-conditioned courtrooms and legislative chambers. The political gridlock in the capital immediately translated into physical mobilization on the streets.
The sources extensively document the fallout, specifically focusing on the March of the Majority.
Yeah, the epicenter of this mobilization was Medellin.
And the data regarding attendance is highly contested, which is pretty standard in polarized environments.
Official police reports estimated 92,000 attendees.
While the organizers claimed a number approached 500,000.
But regardless of the precise headcount, the sociological analysis highlights a profound shift in the demographics of the marchers.
Because this was not the standard demographic for a Colombian street protest.
No. Historically, massive mobilizations were orchestrated by left-wing labor unions, student movements, public sector workers.
But the chronicles from Medellin described a completely different crowd.
Terrified small business owners, local merchants, independent contractors, middle-class professionals.
These citizens were not boozed in by union bosses. They organically mobilized out of genuine, deep-seated panic regarding the security of their pensions, private property rights, and macroeconomic stability.
And tragically, the historical context of Colombia dictates that whenever institutional tension reaches a boiling point and mass mobilizations occur,
asymmetric violence escalates.
the security situation deteriorated rapidly alongside the political crisis. The sources detail a series of horrific incidents during this exact window.
Dissident factions of the FARC orchestrated car bombings in the cities of Cali and Jamundí.
And in Bogotá, an armed attack was launched against the convoy of Miguel Uribe Turbay, a highly visible and vocal opposition senator.
It was a very dark period.
Okay, looking at the totality of this data, the car bombs, the 500,000 people marching, the paralyzed Congress, the executive attempting to rule by decree, and the courts threatening to fire the entire cabinet.
Yeah.
I have to challenge the underlying premise of the academic analysis here. I mean, ask yourself, we have a system where 8 people in a committee room can erase the mandate of a president elected by millions.
Okay.
We have a Supreme Administrative Court, the Council of State, constantly stepping in to annul elections. I mean, the sources mention the Council of State stripped key left-wing operators like Roy Barreras and Alexander Lopez of their Senate seats due to double militancy.
Right, which is a strict electoral law that prohibits politicians from supporting rival candidates or switching parties without resigning their seat a year in advance. The enforcement of double militancy is a highly technical, rigid application of electoral law designed to prevent party hopping and enforce ideological discipline, but it undeniably disrupted the executive's legislative machinery.
Precisely my point. The courts are removing the president's top legislative engineers on technicalities. They are suspending his decrees. The disciplinary agencies are threatening his cabinet with prevaricado. The Congress is an immovable brick wall.
I see where you're going.
From a structural perspective, isn't this the definition of over-judicializing politics? Isn't this just the judicial branch and the traditional establishment utilizing endless bureaucratic paperwork to make it literally impossible for an outsider to govern?
It's a fair question.
Because if the will of the voters is constantly drowned in injunctions and committee votes, it certainly looks like a failing democracy.
Look, the perspective you are articulating is precisely the argument advanced by the executive branch and its supporters during the crisis. They framed the institutional resistance as a soft coup orchestrated by the traditional elite.
Right.
However, the synthesis of the risk analysis reports we are examining reaches the exact opposite conclusion. They do not view the events of mid-2025 as a failure of democracy.
They don't?
No, they view it as a brutal, highly effective stress test of institutional resilience.
So the argument is that the system almost breaking is actually proof that it works.
The argument is that the guardrails held under maximum pressure.
Okay, unpack that.
In a weaker democratic system, a frustrated executive commanding a highly mobilized base facing a paralyzed legislature would have successfully dissolved the Congress or ignored the judicial rulings, triggering a rapid autocratization of the state.
Which we've seen happen globally.
Exactly. We have observed that exact mechanical failure across Latin America and the world. But in Colombia, the courts and the disciplinary agencies acted as a necessary structural pressure valve.
They absorbed the intense political heat generated by the executive and the streets.
And forced it back into legal procedure. The system was pushed to the absolute brink of systemic failure, but the architecture did not snap.
But walking back from that brink requires a mechanism for de-escalation, especially when the primary political actors are locked in a blood feud and refuse to communicate.
Right, and the sources detail the critical intervention of actors completely outside the immediate political arena.
Archbishop Luis José Rueda Aparicio of the Catholic Church stepped in to facilitate quiet, back-channel mediation when the institutional channels were frozen.
Concurrently, civil society organized massive marches of silence. A deliberate, stark contrast to the incendiary rhetoric and the bombings demanding a return to constitutional normalcy.
So faced with an immovable constitutional wall reinforced by the Council of State, the imminent threat of losing his entire cabinet to prevaricado sanctions, and a society broadly rejecting the escalation,
President Petro yielded to the institutional pressure. He formally revoked the June 3rd emergency decree and accepted the constitutional limits of his executive power.
the republic's architecture proved stronger than the immediate political crisis.
It did, and that brings the narrative full circle to the present day, July 2026.
Because the incredibly dramatic, high-stakes prologue of 2025 is the exact reason the current political landscape looks the way it does.
The exact same constitutional architecture, the exact same labyrinth of commissions, and the exact same disciplinary threats that trapped the left in 2025.
Are the weapons the left is wielding today.
The overarching lesson of the last 4 years is that capturing the presidential palace is a largely symbolic victory if you do not simultaneously control the constitutional commissions and maintain ironclad party discipline.
The Historic Pact studied the failures of the right-wing opposition
They observed the right tear itself apart over massive egos.
and waste their political capital complaining about helicopter aesthetics on social media.
The left learned the mechanical lesson. They swapped conceptual frivolity for cold, hard, calculating legislative warfare.
They forged a hostile corporate merger with their worst enemies to capture the Accusations Commission and secure the ultimate insurance policy.
They are utilizing the mandates of the opposition statute to seize control of the congressional agenda and trap the new cabinet in endless political control hearings.
They have successfully formed a Roman phalanx.
You really have. They have seamlessly transitioned from a frustrated, structurally constrained government into the most formidable, disciplined opposition force the country has witnessed in modern history.
And they are currently facing a new right-wing president, Abelardo de la Espriella, who possesses a massive popular mandate for radical economic and security changes.
But absolutely zero institutional armor in the legislature to protect that mandate.
Which leaves us with the ultimate provocative question regarding the immediate future of the Colombian state.
Let's hear it.
We just spent this entire deep dive analyzing how a left-wing president, paralyzed by a hostile Congress, attempted to bypass the system by ruling by decree, nearly burning the country down in the process.
Yeah.
Today, a new hardline president who promised immediate aggressive action is staring down a highly organized, deeply entrenched left-wing blockade that controls every funnel of power.
The ideological labels have completely reversed, but the structural incentives and the institutional traps remain exactly the same.
Taking that a step further, the timeline is the only variable left to resolve. Think about it.
Okay.
How long will it take for this new president, suffocated by the exact same legislative gridlock, to succumb to the exact same temptation?
How long until the tiger decides the only way to fulfill his mandate is to bypass the Congress entirely and attempt to rule by emergency decree?
It highlights the great cyclical danger inherent in any hyper-presidential system when it crashes headlong into an empowered, veto-wielding legislature.
The architecture of a democracy is a living, breathing machine composed of immense tension, constitutional choke points, interlocking phalanxes, and fragile Jenga towers.
When we look at the mechanics of the Colombian state today, we don't see a clean, linear process. We see a system under incredible pressure, functioning exactly as it was designed to function, for better or for worse.
The institutional machine is operating at maximum capacity. The only remaining question is whether the political actors can withstand the friction without breaking the engine.
We are Paco and Lucia, and we hope you enjoyed it, but we want to leave the following reflection. The Historic Pact, with its iron discipline, will eventually return to government in 2030, whereas right-wing and center-right parties without discipline or union will lose the current government. What do you think?